Yeah. Okay. Yes. Okay. Oh, there we go.
There we go. Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Hi, Ross. How are you?
Good. How are you, Jody?
Doing well. Doing well. It looks great behind you.
Yeah. We got the trees.
The beautiful
Definitely rainy. Lake Forest Park, Washington.
late
Very.
for. Well, to everyone who's zooming in or listening in to this Zoom recording, I'm Jody Poloni, and I'm a fiction writer here, zooming in from Maine. And I'm going to be talking a bit and asking my friend Ross McMeekin to share some thoughts about his new story collection, which is called Below the Falls, and it's published by 30 West in Philadelphia, out of Philadelphia, which is near and dear to me because I grew up in Philadelphia. So I love that this book by my dear friend Ross is coming out of the state where I hail from. And I'm going to just tell you a little bit about Ross, and we're going to do some chatting and some reading. So thanks for tuning in. Um, Ross is the author of the noir novel, The Hummingbirds, by Skyhorse Publishing. And that can be read and also listened to on audiobook from Libro FM, which is a wonderful audio recording operation out of that part of the area, friend of Ross's. His short fiction has appeared in literary journals and magazines such as Virginia Quarterly Review, Shenandoah, Redivider, and X-Ray. He's won an emerging writing fellowship from Hugo House and Jack Straw Cultural Center in Seattle. And for the last 10 years, he served as editor of the literary journal Spartan. He's the founder and editor of that wonderful literary journal that you can see everything online. I highly recommend visiting it. Ross, what is it, SpartanLiterary.com, or what's the www?
Yeah, it's SpartanLit.com. One word,
SpartanLit.com.
SpartanLit.com. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just really great. I was actually this morning going back. They have archives going way back, 10 years or something. 4 times a year they publish 3 or 4 flash fictions. I think all under 1,000 words.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, is the call. And they're always looking for new talent over there at Spartan. It's a wonderful place if you're interested in flash fiction and really short fiction to see some of the best people writing those types of stories um, these days. So here we go. We're going to just launch in and just chit chat now. That was sort of the formal business. Um, what I love about this book so much is I just keep saying, oh my gosh, the variety of stories in this collection, long, short, but the variety of voice and topic, um, it shows such a range of you as a writer, but it also somehow holds together too. There's something about it in the subtext or um, it's not even style or tone or voice. It's just something that holds it all together. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about, love to hear first how you came to be a short fiction writer. We'll start there. Why don't we just start?
Yeah. Yeah. I think um, it started really when I first was introduced to some really great short fiction. And I hadn't read, like growing up, I hadn't read a lot of it. I'd mostly read novels or nonfiction. And in high school, I had a great English class my senior year that started to introduce me to these other writers that were writing short fiction. Like we read James Baldwin's Sonny's Blues. We read Kafka's Metamorphosis, which I realize is a novella, but like it's in that vibe, and then introduced me to Kafka's stories and it made me want to continue to study it. And so I did, and that eventually led the way to my undergrad experience as an English major. And I got introduced to a ton more writers of short fiction, notably like Flannery O'Connor, who continues to be one of my all-time favorites, and Raymond Carver as well. Ditto with Raymond Carver. And I wasn't really writing short fiction, but that was kind of grist for the mill, so to speak. Like I just was inside of that form. And then after a few years, I started taking creative writing classes, extension classes at UCLA. And that's when I really got introduced to like more short fiction and the craft of writing, as opposed to just the analysis of the texts and the meaning, but more of how the meaning was actually formed, and how it was written. And I went to grad school. We went to grad school together at Vermont College of Fine Arts. And there, I mean, it's just you get introduced to such great writers. For me, it was Lori Moore, Amy Hempel, Pinckney Benedict. Again, more Raymond Carver, but also like the professors that we had, David Joss, Nance Van Winkle, Clint McCown, Abby Frucht, and so many more, where we're just inundated. And then we got to read other students' work. Like got to read your work, and Mary Stein, who these are, friends for life now, but people we got to be in workshops and read each other's stuff and kind of get into each other's voices. And so it kind of just slowly built through my life to the point where it's like now it's just something that I do, is write short stories, read short stories. And so that's kind of how it came about.
Yeah. Yeah. So for those of you who might not know, Ross and I went to Vermont College of Fine Arts together. We graduated the summer of 2011, and sometime a couple months before graduation, we started putting our heads together with another writer, Mary Stein, about how we might continue to support each other by swapping out stories. And we would meet monthly and we'd share stories and we'd give each other feedback and we'd get on some kind of a call. I don't remember, we were doing Skype way back then, I think.
Yeah, there
Um,
wasn't Zoom yet. Yes.
and then we went to Google. We had all these different ways of finding each other, but from Maine to Minnesota to Seattle. And we've been doing that for 13 years. And some of the ways we do it has changed up. Now we get together and we write, to keep each other accountable once a month. We'll write for 5 hours in our own, in our own space and just check in with each other. And we're not swapping out work as much. But this is kind of maybe jumping a little bit ahead, but how has like having that literary community been helpful for you? Like this has been a 13-year process, really, because I remember reading some of these stories way back in the beginning. And I remember when you
Yeah.
got, some of your first publications, fabulous, Virginia Quarterly Review, Shenandoah, some others, Passages North, um, and so I don't know, I guess I'd like to talk a little bit about how the book kind of came to be over 13 years. Like, what was that process? Because I think a lot of times people like to know that. Like, how do you decide? How do you work on these stories? How do you decide what goes in, what stays out? Like, so what was the journey for you for this? And whatever you want to talk about, because that's a big
Sure.
open topic.
Yeah,
And,
no, I think
and then maybe you can throw in there how other people and having a writing community helped that happen for you.
yeah, I think having like a community of you and Mary definitely was having people read my writing, take it seriously, and but also just get to know my voice. We got to know each other's voice, so it became less about this is like the way a story should be, and more like you're giving me feedback, knowing my voice, like almost like am I being true to myself? Within that context, I feel like we now know each other's style, and it's like I could recognize a Jody or a Mary story if it was like a blank title on it. And I think what's been helpful is some of the stuff you talked about, like encouragement, accountability, feedback, recommendations of other books. Like that's something that you're great at. It's like, oh, I read this story, Ross. You should check out this book. You did that with. I know you just won or you're a finalist for the Maine Literary Awards for short fiction. I think you mentioned Dave Patterson,
Yeah.
right? And you suggested one of his books to me that I read that for another novella that I was working on, Love in the Afterlife. So there's this continual conversation that's going on about different books, different literature, our own writing. And that I think it's so important just because, especially as I've gotten older and had children, that the community, in the pandemic, the community's kind of shrunk a little bit more. And it's like writing can be lonely. And if you're in that place of isolation, you're not having these conversations about writing and about authors and trying to get better and improve your craft, then it can get you kind of slow down,
Yeah.
right? I feel like you kind of it doesn't get a little dull, but it like you don't have that same sense of excitement. You introduce a good book. I mean, for me, it's like when I get introduced to a good book, I want to write. It's one of those things that like it gets me excited to write myself. And so yeah, I think that aspect of community is great. And also, you just get to like we've gone to conferences and like AWP, you can hang out there. You can go to different places and retreats, and you've got a community there. You're not just flying solo. So yeah, I think that's part of it for sure.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier Pinckney Benedict, and you introduced his work to me, and I love his work, and I do feel that there is a quality to his writing that reminds me of yours. That that there are certain writers that it's like, oh yeah, that's a Ross writer. That's and I know I've sent you some other people out too that I found where I'm like, oh, Ross would love this, and but you've also done that for me as well, and that's been really great. So the thing that I love about your stories, well, many things I love about your stories. Ross and I were talking a little earlier about how we could talk for an hour about each one of his stories. Like we're just going to try and focus in here for this short talk. Um, but one of the things that really comes through is how much your stories are about relationship. And I don't know if you would think of it that way, but it's like I remember being in school and we said, a story is either about man versus nature, or man versus
Right.
the self. And it was like, you had to sort of decide what was this story about. And your stories really are about all three of those things. Your stories always have characters that are grappling with, their themselves, which is, good literary fiction, but there's often a relationship going on, and often it's set against the backdrop of some like incredible outdoor space, place, or even scene where people are doing things in the wilds, and often that is a big part of supporting what the story's about. So I thought we'd talk about a couple stories in general. And the first one I picked, and I was hoping that maybe you would be willing to even read a little bit from it. One of my favorite all-time stories is called Small Fiery Bloom. And this story, just for the listeners who haven't read it yet, we're really in the mind of one character throughout the whole story, and yet there's a relationship with another character, which I'll just have you read till about the middle of the second page of the story, and we'll leave the listeners hanging so that they'll have to go out and buy the book.
Yes. All
Which we'll,
right.
we'll
Yeah.
talk
No,
about at
good.
the end how they can get hold of this book. It's a beautiful book.
Yeah.
So go ahead. Why don't you go ahead? I'm going to mute and have you go ahead, and we can just sit back and enjoy the reading.
Cool. All right. Small fiery bloom. One morning in the last winter of her long life, a widow sat by the window overlooking acres of fallow farmland cloaked in deep snow. A fire grumbled and hissed in the wood stove behind her. A cup of coffee cooled on the armrest. In her lap sat a plate of peppered eggs. She took a bite and glanced up. On the deck outside stood a bird she'd never laid eyes on before. Its plumage was raven black, and its size that of a starling, though it was clearly neither species. On its chest, in the place below its neck where one might hang a medallion, gleamed a feathered patch of turquoise. As if perceiving an audience, the bird puffed its wings into a black oval disc and agitated its feathers so that the color pattern resembled two turquoise eyes and a morose turquoise mouth. The bird proceeded to bob and jerk on its needle legs, which appeared even more diminutive amidst the broad display. While dancing, it erupted in a series of sharp, timed clicks clearly audible through the window pane. The bird continued to dance in fits and starts. The widow watched in astonishment. Meanwhile, an unseasonable warmth blossomed inside of her. She absently touched the tips of her fingers to her lips, then moved them to her cheeks, which flushed at her own touch. Soon the dance came to an end, and the bird reassumed its common shape. Briefly, it stood erect, eyeing the window before hopping a few times to the edge of the deck and taking flight, a quick black puff flitting low across the snowy plain. The widow stayed seated for some time, hoping the bird would return. Once her coffee got cold, she left the window, creaked up the stairs, and opened the door to her deceased husband's office. Inside were stacks of yellowed paper and dozens of antiquated textbooks, a mess she hadn't touched in the decades since his passing. It took until early afternoon, but finally, her excavation yielded a glossy, hardbound avian desk reference with an illustration of her visitor, a male Lafarina superba, a bird of paradise native to the South Pacific. Its performance was a mating display. Stop there. Yeah.
Yes, yes, stop there because the story does go on, but what a great place to leave listeners hanging. Um, so we find out right away that she's a widow sitting by a window. And I just love the way in the story, even though she's inside, place is, really present in the piece. It's, we've got weather, it's cold, it's got this landscape and it's got this bird right up against it that's, seemingly out of place, right? It's a bird from, the South Pacific in the snowy landscape. And she's sitting there with on her lap is a plate of peppered eggs. And it seems like such a mundane detail that becomes incredibly powerful by the end of the story. So, I love David Joss's lectures on detail when we had, when he taught us about detail at college. This is like a master class in short fiction where the setup in the very first couple of sentences, which seems totally mundane, and there's just these details that, there's the fire, there's the snow, all of it, and yet it just, I mean, once we get to the end, we come right back to the beginning, which I think a really good short story does. So if you want to find out the significance, readers, of these peppered eggs, I highly recommend getting Ross's book and reading Small Fiery Bloom among all the other ones. And was that one published? I have it's in the back here. Was that one? That one was published.
Dr. T.J. Eckelberg review,
Oh, perfect.
which I don't think is in existence anymore. It was Johns Hopkins
Yeah.
had a literary journal, and they did kind of more speculative stuff like this story. So
Yes, that's a perfect home for that story. Yeah, I love that. Love that place. So, and that's what I mean too about the range. Like even within the story, there's so much realism, and then we have this other thing going on, and we're not quite sure about it. Um, but we believe it. We believe it's all happening just as it says it is because it is. It's just got that flavor. All right, so that was a great example about how some of Ross's stories have, these one character or relationship with something outside of the self, but that is not human. It's more than human interaction. Um, so one of my favorites, Ross, Small Fiery Bloom. Um, and then you have several stories that involve the couple dynamic, the romantic partnership, and a number of ways. There's couples who, are where one of the people is involved under duress in a way because, she wants something and he's willing to give her something, but it's not great. It's not a great setup for why they're together. And we have another one where a young teenage boy is figuring out his sexuality and who he's attracted to. So there's such a variety even among the stories that involve couples that show so many different ways of being in relationship with another person at that level. My favorite of those is The Island. Um, Again, place, I love based writing. Place plays a huge role in this piece. I mean it's really a third character for me in this piece. We have Owen and we have Aubrey, and then we have where they are that plays such a significant role in this story and how they move about this space and
Mm.
how where he stands in the story and what he views has a lot to do with what's going on for him internally. So I actually wanted you to read two sections from this story, if you wouldn't mind. I'd love
Sure.
you to read the opening to the first little, squiggly mark there. And then I'd love for you to jump ahead to page 45 in my book, where Owen finds that carved out section of the forest edge. So it's a couple pages there.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah, great.
Okay, great. So yeah, we'll just again sit back and just enjoy the read and just like also just listen for the musicality of Ross's lines. They're just really beautiful prose.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. All right, The Island. Owen watched Aubrey press her palm into a thick patch of speckled moss girdling the trunk of an old Douglas fir. The move was gentle and precise, how a mime might seek an invisible wall, and he couldn't help but imagine her locked up in some dark basement, kidnapped, as he suspected she'd been as a child. Feel, she said of the moss. It's so soft you could sleep on it. She flinched and looked up. Rain. The canopy was thick with greens and browns and had been dripping since they'd reached the small, uninhabited island that morning. They'd set off from Friday Harbor a few days before to tour the San Juan Islands by kayak. The trip was her idea. When crossing deep channels, he found himself fearing broad-chested sea lions with swells of blubber on their necks. Then muscular pods of orcas, rogue waves, freak storms, mindless currents, water so cold that hypothermia took only minutes to set in. Somehow she found this sort of thing relaxing, loved it, and he loved her. They'd left their kayaks on the edge of the forest, bike locked to a sapling. She'd called the lock absurd, but he could tell that she also found it endearing, as she did most of his other little obsessions. In that way, at least, love made sense. What failed lovers found annoying, true lovers found comic. Maybe, he said about the potential rain. It's tough to tell here in the woods. Aubrey looked around. Despite the summer warmth, she hugged herself. It does feel like we're inside. And then jump ahead. Um, right. Owen found a thin, carved-out section of the forest edge near the lone swatch of beach. He took off his shoes and shirt and waded into the water. It felt warm. The sun must have baked the rocks and sand before the tidewater rushed in and smothered it. He looked down the shore and could see Aubrey up on the point behind her easel, crowded in by tan madronas grown wild and distorted from the sea winds. She reached up and shook out her long, curly mess of hair. He caught his breath. Lately, whenever he felt that clench of desire come upon him, it immediately turned to a dull ache as he imagined what might have happened to her. He wished he could share that sorrow with her. That wish then flickered into anger. She was hoarding it and pushing him away in the process. He wondered whether he was just afraid of commitment and if he simply felt threatened by her silence because of it. He gazed at the sun shining over the outlying islands. The water was a mirror, and what blue it reflected would have been inviting to most anyone else. He glanced up. Aubrey waved. He waded further into the lagoon. He felt like he had to, if only to prove that he wasn't afraid. The cool water rose above his thighs, and his breath quickened. There didn't seem to be much current, so he kept on. The water met his belly button, then his midsection. He counted to 3 and made a half-hearted dive. The chill shocked his chest and his neck. He began to swim, first a couple of strokes, then a few more. But when he tried to touch bottom, he felt only the formlessness of water. He turned, struggling for breath, feeling he might float away. The currents. He paddled as hard as he could toward shore, trying to keep his head above water. His lungs wouldn't fill. There wasn't enough air in the world. He was about to call out to Aubrey for help when his foot scuffed the bottom. He surged forward until he was standing again, salt water lapping at his stomach. He turned and looked, panting. Again, Aubrey waved, perhaps laughed. He couldn't tell.
Thank you. So a lot of times when we swap out stories with each other, we talk about and give feedback. We often talk about, and you often lead with, you'll say, so what is this story about? And this is what you do with your hands. So what is this story about?
What is this story?
And I love that. And I love that because I don't often necessarily even think about that. I'm just writing the story and you're always great at getting me to be like, zero in there, Jode. So tell me about this story because this story is about so many things and I think I know what it's about, but maybe without giving away any spoilers. What do you think this story is about? What are all the things? What is it mostly about, would you say?
Yeah, it's tough. The aboutness is tough, even if you write a story, you publish it, and you're like, I don't even really know if that's about. But for this one, for me, I think there's like a central tension that's going on here. That there's a desire on Owen's part for greater intimacy with Aubrey. And there's a desire on Aubrey's part to leave her past behind. And both of those are intermingled because Owen believes that if he knows more about her past, their relationship will grow. And Aubrey believes that that doesn't have to be the case, that she doesn't need to reintroduce that part into the relationship. She's moved past it.
Mhm.
So I think that that's a tension. I think that I see that at the time, like I saw that tension, I think playing out. I don't know if it was within the context of like a movie culture or a friend of that thing. How much of my past do I need to share for this relationship to work? When it's, there's no like tried and true rule to it, right? And so that's the tension they live in. So I think the aboutness is, for me, is kind of about living with that tension and choosing to move forward with that tension without having it resolved. And that's also for me how relationships work. You live with tension that can't be resolved, because everything's not perfect, all the time. So that's kind of what I think for me, I think that story attempts at least to show is a couple moving forward with that tension towards a commitment, but there being a sort of unresolved mystery to it as well.
Mhm. Yeah, and thinking about like backstory in real life and backstory in fiction, this is also what we're playing with all the time as writers, like how much backstory do you give the reader? And in a short fiction especially, like you can stretch out a little more in a novel, but in short fiction, conventionally, the wisdom is don't have a lot of backstory. People
Yeah,
can do whatever they want, whatever works. Sometimes it works really well to have it. Thinking of Alice Munro, but
yeah.
for you, do you remember the iterations of this story? I kind of remember some of the iterations of the story. Do you remember them? Like, do you kind of remember all the different renditions of story that you write, takes, and where you decide? Like, did you have an aha moment with this story when you knew, okay, this story is exactly how I want it to be? Like, how do you know when that's happening for you?
I think it takes a while. Like this story, like you said, you probably did see, I probably sent it you to edit it probably 3 or 4 times before it got to where it was. Because that's, as you know, I obsess over this stuff. I think that's what we writers do. We obsess. So for me, it went through a lot of iterations and I took it to workshops and until I understood what the story was going for, even if it was still a little vague, which I think can be good, if it's too spot on, then you lose the mystery of the story, I think. So it's like it's not like totally dialed in. But until I knew what it was about, it was much more expansive and much more into backstory, much more like explore. You talk about exploratory drafts, and it's like where I was just stretching out and saying, what is this? Once I begin to dial it in a little bit more, that's when I start to edit. And you know me, for me, I really try to compress it. And so that definitely happened in this story. But there were earlier versions where, for instance, we don't know what Aubrey's, what happened to Aubrey. We don't at the end of the story fully know what happened.
Mhm.
And it's never explicit. Yeah. There were times where we knew exactly what happened in the story, where it's like, well, it's spelled out and it's like that changed. I feel like I know what happened, but like there's so much within the context of the story. It's not important to know what happened to Aubrey for this story, so that's where it's like I can leave that out, and leave it up to the reader's imagination. So I don't
I
know if
love,
that answers, but
yeah, it
yeah.
totally does, and I love that answer because for this story you wrote a lot more and then you took a lot away. And
Right.
then I remember too, you do have a very Ray Carver-esque, sentence style, um and you show a lot, and then I remember you adding some layers of his interiority that really shifted and changed and deepened, I felt as the reader, the meaning. But your use of even like stage action, like even moving people around in this story where they are, how Aubrey deals with her trauma on the page, we see in her behavior, like there's so much subtext in that white space, right? We have to kind of plug in, ooh, but we get to see it. You show it really well. So I think this story got to a really good place of just the perfect balance of, all of your gifts, and then all the ways that you also made this story just better and better and better every time you took another look. And it's kind of like you're in a relationship with the story too. So again, that theme of relationship comes up because the writer is in relationship to the story as well as in relationship to all the relationships going on in this story. And I just also think I remember I was really struggling in one of my semesters, and you know David Joss said, all right, I want you to write a story for your next packet where you have two people and they're stuck in a room together. They can't get out, they can't leave. It's a great prompt because
Yeah.
it forces you to just, and there can't be backstory. I mean, eventually that story that I wrote did have a little bit of backstory, but he really was trying to get me to stay right in, and that's what this story is such a great example of, because they're stuck on this island, they're literally on an island. Like
Hmm.
what a great premise for and setting for a story about what the story is about. Anyway, highly recommend. This story, The Island, was originally published in Green Mountains Review, which is a Vermont public Johnson State College in Vermont.
Yeah.
They have a beautiful literary journal there. I hope they do. I know there was some talk about it going away, but they have a lot of good stuff at Green Mountains Review, and Ross's story, The Island, is one of them. So that's great. And then the other thing that I wanted to sort of touch on is because I know a lot of writers out there and readers too. They kind of like to know a little bit about the writer's life and how the writer handles. I sometimes used to help run the Brattleboro Literary Festival, and one of the questions that came up after every reading was, tell us about your writing habits, tell us about your schedule, your writing. How do you? And I'm not going to necessarily ask you to do that, but while we were together, a lot of babies were born in the last 13 years.
It's true.
I had three grandchildren. You had two children. Mary had a child. And I think that births were the only time we ever missed. I don't think we missed very many months. But if we
Mhm.
did, it was probably because there was a baby being born
Yeah,
on our day, or something
totally.
around there. Um, so I noticed that your stories started to include the parent-child relationship. So that's
Mhm.
another one that features. Now, some of them were written before you had your own children, but a lot of the stories that involve, the parent-child dynamic came after you became a parent. And I know that you are the primary parent. And so I just thought it might be interesting to tell us a little bit about how that changed your writing life, how that inspires it, how that detracts from it, whatever you want to say about it. But I know a lot of people out there struggle with how to balance everything, whether it's parents or something else, becoming a parent or something else that happens. Like maybe it's the person is a caregiver all of a sudden, or maybe they have something big happening at work. But there are things in our lives all the time that are creeping in and threatening to take us away from this practice that we love. And I just thought maybe you talk a little bit about parenting and writing, and then I want to hear from a little bit from one of your stories or the whole. I'd love if you'd read the whole story, Togetherness. But
Oh yeah, yeah,
so why don't you
absolutely.
just talk a little bit about that, and then just launch in whenever you're
Yeah, no.
when you're done.
I mean, in my wild pre-child days, yeah, things were different. As far as writing habits, they have changed pretty dramatically since I've had kids, and also with the pandemic kind of being in there too. But in talking about that, I mean, really, just straight up, what I used to do is I would go to work in the morning, come home, have some lunch, go play pickup basketball, come home, and then I'd spend the afternoon writing until my wife came home from work, and then we'd just hang out, watch Seinfeld, do whatever we were gonna do, and so I kind of had that. Everything was kind of shifted towards the evening and the afternoon. And what I began to realize I, once I had my daughter and then my son, that began to change. As far as anyone who's had an infant knows that, your schedule is really fluid, I guess you could say. And also when you get up, when you go to sleep, when you get your rest, if you're able to get your rest, changes as well. So the schedule got a little wonky for a little bit, but as it started to like get going, what I realized is that I wanted to I wrote and had the best space for writing really early in the morning. And I think that was for a couple reasons. One is that's the time where and space where in the house I have no responsibilities. And that's like, during the day at any given time, I could be called upon to do something or I needed to do something. And everything just I think there's this headspace thing where it just feels busier. Even if I don't have anything on the schedule, I know that I can be taken away. But I guess I write from 2 until 5 in the morning. And I do that every day, and I don't have an alarm. That's when I wake up, and that's like my time. Like everyone's asleep, no one's awake, and there's headspace there, that I know I'm not going to be taken away from it. So that means I go to bed a little bit earlier, but very different lifestyle from what I was living before. And just because, yeah, I had a friend who told me that when you have kids, this is before he said it's like one of your bodily organs is walking around outside of you, and it's like you're always thinking about that. And it's like you feel all that stuff, it's like all the stuff that your child is going through, you feel it. And so there's this like emotional place, and I wouldn't change a thing. Obviously, I love my kids, but that also makes finding time, place to do it challenging. I think that's why a lot of people, and I've done this before too, that you go on retreats because you need not just, you may have time to write 3 hours a day, um, you know, every week, but it's different. You go to a retreat and you have 3 hours a day, all of a sudden you find yourself being more productive because you've got that space and the lack of responsibility. So there's a balance, I think, that kind of comes with it. But to answer your question about is it inspiring and what do I write stories? I would say, yeah. I mean, I'm drawn to complexity in stories, and just like you are, we want these tensions. We want these, that's interesting. So, what I found in raising children is how complicated it is. Like it's this whole other level of complication of community that comes with it, um, of dynamics, of understanding your children where they're at. They're this age, 6 years old is very different from 7 years old. So everything's fluid, everything's changing, like as it's going. So I love that complication, but but there's also just the joys that that you didn't have. I mean, Seinfeld is great, but like when your kid is having a great time laughing at a cartoon, it's better, So there's these joys that come with it, and the pain, and that's having children has definitely opened up my emotions on a level that they weren't at before. I so yeah, yeah. Love children, but you've got to wake up at 2 in the morning to write.
That's
That's
right.
it's
And
the
I
trade-off.
love I love that you get away too, and a lot of times you'll go out someplace in nature, like even more rural than the Seattle, where you live outside in Seattle, but in this like beautiful little wooded area. Um, and your stories have so much of that in them. I'm sure that and I know sometimes you'll also go out and just get out during the week, right? And even take your kids with, but you'll just need to get out there and just be in that landscape, which can really clear out the space. I know that's true too.
Yeah, for me,
So
that's yeah.
we're talking about Below the Falls, which is an incredible story collection from Ross McMeekin at 30 West Publishing out of Philadelphia. Beautiful, small, independent press that creates amazing artifacts of all kinds of beautiful books. So check that out and check them out. So I would love for you to read Togetherness. It's a little bit of a longer read at this point, and if you're still here, thanks for being here. And I was just gonna have Ross go ahead and read that whole story, because that's how the story works as a whole complete piece. So just sit back and relax, enjoy the story.
Togetherness. Dozens of kids on a playground, a mess of sound and color, all dangling from webbing, spinning, swinging, booting soccer balls into goals, sneezing into masks in the freshly mowed field. Everyone is in motion except for Owen's daughter, Isabel. He's worried. From a small hill adjacent to the playground, he watches her rest against a post of the parallel bars, alone, looking down at her hands, maybe resisting the urge to chew her nails, a habit she'd probably picked up from him during their long days together in isolation. Most of these kids Isabel hasn't seen in person since the pandemic started. She's just getting used to it all again. They all are. He hears his name and turns. It's Derek, the father of one of the kids in Isabel's distance learning class the previous year. They bump fists. His short black hair has thinned since he last saw him, but other than that, he seems pretty much the same, wearing a ubiquitous gray Patagonia shirt with a blue and orange fish spanning the chest. Before they can do anything more than exchange greetings, they're joined by Meredith, Derek's partner. She wears a black t-shirt, screen printed with a large turquoise heart, and her thick blonde hair is fastened in a low barrette, shaping her face like an oval frame. Owen, she says, I saw your lovely daughter. My, she has grown. You're like the third person to tell me that. It's funny. You don't notice when you're with them all day, every single day, she says. Lord help us, says Derek. Lord help them, she says. Owen laughs and glances over to the playground. Isabel is playing with her braid, talking to a couple of other girls at the edge of the grass. She's acting naturally, and he feels relief. So yeah, did you have a good experience online with Miss Okafor? Isabel loved her. Miss Okafor was great, said Derek. Remarkable the way the teachers pivoted to online learning. But I still worry the kids may be behind. We're all behind together, Meredith says. She takes a sip of iced coffee. As to your question about distance learning, it went well, all things considered. How did Errol hold up through it all? She glances over to Derek, but he doesn't notice. Well, we were really blessed to have a good pod to quarantine with. Good families, good kids, kept the bubble tight. I feel kind of bad admitting we had one because, we just got scared he would fall behind socially. That they'd formed a pod surprises Owen. He'd assumed they were all in isolation as a family like him. On Facebook, they posted pictures of marches, politics, equity issues, and he appreciated that. But ever since school buildings closed, there were no pictures of the kids together on social media, nor of the parents. For some reason, I didn't realize you. We wanted to keep it quiet because, well, you know how it is. But then the kids get on the playground, and the next thing you know, everyone knows what brand of toothpaste you use, so we might as well confess it up front. Actually, we're all getting together at the beach after the picnic, says Derek. You're welcome to come. Thanks, that's kind of you, Owen says, because he feels he must be polite. Out on the field, he sees his daughter. She's alone again, watching a soccer game from the sidelines, kids whirring around her. She's wearing sandals, and he wishes he had convinced her to wear tennis shoes so she could play. She played soccer as a second grader, but said that she didn't want to continue with it this year, despite him trying to convince her otherwise. Yeah, says Meredith, you should really come to the party. After the kids finished up school, we decided to meet back up as a pod once a month, but we're hoping to branch out and make it a community event. So how many people were in yours? As she speaks, she seems to open up. 6 families, 9 kids total. Kids all met at our house. We cleared out the basement, 5 days a week, 8 to 5. She shakes her head as if in disbelief. Wow, how did you manage all the kids? Well, we were blessed with a fantastic teacher. Just graduated from Seattle Pacific in elementary education and needed a job. The kids absolutely adored her. But she was really just a tutor, says Derek, hands out an assurance. Meredith blinks. Yes, not a teacher. We have to be careful not to say teacher. It sounds like we are running a private school or something. And as you know, we're public all the way. She and Derek continue to tell about the experience, game nights, slumber parties, boundaries, disagreements. A plane overhead blanks towards SeaTac, but Owen isn't listening. He wonders how many other families in the school had ignored health regulations and issues of equity and quietly formed pods and hired teachers. He imagines hours upon hours of those kids being together, elbow to elbow, masks off, with someone whose sole purpose was to walk back and forth between them to help them with their online activities. He thinks of 9 kids playing together in a backyard, learning to work out their differences, supervised by a person with a master's degree in caring for them. He realizes that, for some, the classroom size had shrunk to a perfect number. Isabel would never have those experiences, more than a year's worth, ones he assumed they'd all tacitly agreed not to have. He feels incredibly foolish for assuming such a thing, and he can't take any satisfaction in some moral high ground their isolation has won them, because he knows if he'd been asked, he likely would have let Isabel join their pod. He'd even thought about seeking one out. In the end, he'd been afraid of her getting sick and, conscious of the unfairness of pods, he figured people like Meredith and Derek would look down on it. These were the parents of the kids she'd be friends with, and those relationships were important to maintain because he knew parents had creative ways of encouraging their kids to play with some kids more than others. How about you? Derek asks. What were your arrangements with Isabel? It takes him a moment to respond. In his mind, he sees her sitting across the room from him, both in front of their computers, struggling through work. He recalls how, as the pandemic wore on, their free times together, breakfasts, lunch breaks, late afternoons, were more and more filled with silence, and she began to read in her room with cats instead of going on a walk to the park with him. You okay? Meredith asks. It was just the two of us. That's wonderful. Derek rubs his hands together. I bet you guys grew close. That's special. So special, Meredith says, though I'm sure it was tough. But I bet in some ways you'll look back at this time as a blessing in disguise. Well, like I said, we really hope you'll join our party. We have plenty of pizza for you and Isabel. Thank you. It's the last thing he wants to do, go to the party, but Isabel is still out on the field alone. A group of kids nearby play what looks to be tag. He wills her to join in. She doesn't. Let me get your phone numbers just in case we can't make it. It would be great to get the kids together soon, either way. After trading numbers, Derek and Meredith leave, and Owen finds some shade beneath the chestnut tree away from the rest of the parents. Isabel's still there by the soccer game, hands stuffed into the pockets of her shorts. He has a few conversations in his head where, instead of playing it casual, he calls out Meredith and Derek's hypocrisy, but his heart isn't in it because of Isabel. She's looking at her hands again, oblivious, as a soccer ball shoots past her, followed by kids chasing it, all rushing by her like salmon swimming upstream.
Oh, this story just gets me. Oh, the story gets me every time. Brilliant, Ross. Really, it's really hard. So what I love about this story is how it takes, this pretty big cultural issue, that we all went through this in our own ways. We all went through this pandemic. I love, the masks are mentioned. There's a lot about it that talks about the pandemic without, calling it COVID or, really naming it. It's just happened. It happened, and it's part of the story. And this is them coming back together in community. And there's an incredible betrayal here that the father experiences, Isabel's father experiences when he is just, you know, finds out that this thing has gone on sort of behind their backs, and that he was, they weren't included in it. But also, what does that mean when we say we're one thing and then we behave in this kind of other yucky way? And then it's such a great job with Derek and Meredith. There's subtle differences between those two characters. Um, and you also show an amazing, you do an amazing job using dialogue, and then stepping out of scene into the interior thought. His imagination, that part where the imagination starts to go a little, off. You take the reader down this little trail, and I love that. We're totally with you. And then he imagines this whole thing, and the teacher has a master's degree. I mean, there's some humor in it too, like a lot of humor, but it's, dark humor because it's, funny, not funny, right?
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, and then I also just love how that comes back around where, he imagines again, he in her mind, in his mind, he sees her sitting across the room from him. So he's now also going back and thinking about what that was actually like, and the pain of that is just shown so beautifully. I think this story is brilliant. I think it's a brilliant study in how to use dialogue and scene and balance that out with the character's interiority, but just as a short story and not as sort of like a looking at it from the point of view of craft. It just really, it's like it just really gets at so many levels of the heart space, and every time, and I find, feel like these goosebumps coming over me in reading it and hearing you read it too. The way that what builds here is more and more information just is slowly kind of spooled out, and he's kind of having to deal with this, and he's kind of having to stay polite, right? He's got to like say, yeah, hey, thanks for the offer, hey, give me your numbers. Meanwhile, he's devastated, and that really comes across on the page. And the moment we see her on the soccer field and we remember she's wearing sandals with her hands in her pockets, I mean, it's just, ugh, what a detail there. Just beautiful, brilliant. So much compassion, and clearly, this writer understands all these ins and outs of not just being a parent, but being among other parents in a community center, in a community setting. I know you have a lot of stories actually set at a community center, which will probably be your next
Yeah.
collection or your next novel. But thank you for reading that. That was great to hear that whole story in all of its totality, in totality. That was great. Well, we're coming up upon an hour, so if you're still with us, thank you so much for being here and listening in. We're here to celebrate Ross McMeekin, my writing buddy of 13 years plus. His short story collection Below the Falls, out by 30 West Publishing. Ross, can you tell us a little bit about how we get this? Is it everywhere books are sold, or how do you?
Yeah, you could. There's a few ways. The first is you can order it from the publisher, and that's a cool thing to do because the publishers, small press publishers aren't, they're always, they're operating a lot of the time on shoestring budgets. It's so to be able to order it, they get a bigger piece of the pie, which is great. So I try to do that. Through bookstores, you can order it through bookstores, and yeah, just tell them that I'd like this, and there's a few bookstores around here that are stocking it,
Mhm.
and a few out east, but you can order it through a bookstore or online retailers, of course, as well. So
Everywhere. Okay.
yeah.
That's the beauty of it. And another day we can maybe have another conversation about publishing and that whole deal. What are you working on right now? We'll end with one
Right.
last question. What are you working on now?
I've got a novel that's set in the early 1900s in like an approximation of the Pacific Northwest. It was inspired by the deadliest avalanche in United States history, which happened about 30 miles that way. And and it has to do with the Great Northern Railroad, but it's also an approximation. It's not trying to be strictly historical fiction. It's kind of got a little bit of a Charles Portis True Grit vibe to it, which I love. A little bit of a Cormac McCarthy Suttree vibe to it as well, and both of those writers have a sense of humor in that, so it's hopefully humorous. So I've been working on that, and that's been a lot of fun. I'm probably a couple 3 years away from from finishing it, but that's the nature of novels. They take years and years and years, At least they take me years and years and years. And then I'm always getting distracted by short stories. This morning, I was writing a short story when I should have been working on the novel because I just always find myself drawn. I don't know if Jody, if you feel that way too. I'm like drawn back into stories, just because I love writing them. So I will I'll probably send you the story that I'm working on today probably soon to get feedback. So yeah, that's what I'm working on.
Great. That sounds great. I have read some opening chapters of your current novel. I know
Yeah.
it's changed some already, but so Ross has a novel, Hummingbirds. He has Below the Falls, and soon to be something forthcoming, I'm sure. And also you can visit his website at it's just rossmcmeekin.com.
Yep.
And a lot of his stories are published in some journals that have them online. So you can actually go to Ross's website and read some of his stories online. Get yourself a copy of the book. And thank you so much for doing this today, Ross. And thank you, everybody who has gotten this far and stayed with us. Please pass it on. We'd love to get the word out. Anybody that you know that likes to hear about writing or hear good writing, this is a great Zoom call for them. So thanks again, and we'll see you all soon.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. Okay.